The cliff is silent except for the wind. Far below, waves crash against the rocks. A young woman inches forward, her bare feet gripping the rough stone. In one hand, she clutches a woven basket. With the other, she reaches into a nest tucked inside a narrow crack. She pauses. One wrong step, and she could fall to her death. Yet she reaches anyway. Inside the nest lie only a few small treasures. Eggs. She carefully lifts them one by one, cradling them as though they were made of glass. When the basket is full, she turns and begins the long climb back to her family, who have been waiting since sunrise. Tonight, those eggs may be the only rich source of protein they eat. There are no farms, no villages, no markets. No chickens scratching in fenced yards. No one has planted wheat. No one has built a city. Civilization does not yet exist. And yet, people are already searching for eggs. Long before humanity learned to bake bread, long before cows were milked, long before kings ruled kingdoms or merchants crossed oceans, eggs were already feeding us. Not because they were luxurious, not because they were rare, but because they were everywhere nature allowed life to flourish. Along sea cliffs crowded with nesting birds, across marshes where ducks returned every spring, in forests alive with wild fowl. For our ancestors, an egg was more than food. It was certainty, a complete meal sealed inside its own natural container, easy to carry, quick to cook, rich in the nutrients needed to survive another day. Most of history is told through monuments, battles, and empires. But those stories begin much later. Long before people learned to build civilizations, they first had to stay alive. And few foods help them do that more reliably than a simple egg. Today, we barely notice the carton waiting in our refrigerator. But hidden inside every shell is one of the oldest partnerships in human history. A story that began thousands of years before civilization itself, and continues every time we crack an egg into a frying pan. Every civilization has its iconic foods. Italy has pasta, Japan has sushi, Mexico has corn, France has bread. But there is one food that belongs to every culture without truly belonging to any of them: the egg. It has no inventor, no homeland, no empire can claim it, no king ever conquered it. And yet, for thousands of years, it has quietly appeared on breakfast tables, market stalls, campfires, royal banquets, and family kitchens across nearly every corner of the world. That is the great paradox of eggs. Today, they are among the least expensive foods in the grocery store. A carton of eggs barely attracts a second glance. We scramble them before work, boil them for lunch, bake them into cakes, breads, and cookies without thinking about where they came from or how long they have been part of the human story. They feel ordinary, perhaps too ordinary. Because when something becomes part of everyday life, it often disappears from history. Yet few foods have influenced humanity as profoundly. An egg is remarkably complete, protected by a shell, naturally portable, packed with protein, healthy fats, vitamins, and minerals. Long before people understood nutrition, they understood something much simpler. People who found eggs stayed alive. Unlike grain, eggs required no fields. Unlike livestock, they required no pasture. Unlike fruit, they did not depend on a single harvest season. Wherever birds nested, food could be found. That simple fact helped generations survive long before the first farms appeared. And when humanity finally began building civilizations, eggs came with us. They traveled from forests into villages, from villages into cities, from cities into kingdoms. Eventually, they became one of the few foods eaten by the rich and the poor alike. Kings served eggs at lavish feasts. Farmers carried them home in woven baskets. Children searched for them in hedgerows. Merchants sold them in crowded marketplaces. The egg crossed every social class without ever losing its value. But the greatest turning point in its history had nothing to do with cooking. It began the day humans stopped searching for wild nests and convinced a small, nervous bird to stay. Long before humans became farmers, we were hunters, gatherers, survivors. Every sunrise began with the same question: where will today's food come from? Some days it came from berries hidden beneath shrubs. Other days from roots buried deep in the ground. If fortune smiled, a successful hunt might feed an entire family for days. But hunting was uncertain. A deer could outrun you. Fish could disappear. Fruit ripened only for a short season. Eggs were different. They couldn't run away. Every spring, nature returned them to the same places. Cliffs echoed with the calls of nesting seabirds. Wetlands filled with ducks and geese guarding their eggs. Forests hid the nests of pheasants, quail, and countless other wild birds. For early humans, learning these seasonal patterns became a skill as valuable as making fire. Finding a nest meant finding a complete meal. No tools were needed to butcher an animal. No field had to be planted. The food was already packaged, protected by a shell designed by nature itself. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric sites across Europe, Asia, and Africa shows that people collected and consumed wild bird eggs thousands of years before agriculture emerged. Fragments of eggshells discovered alongside stone tools reveal that our ancestors weren't simply opportunistic hunters. They understood the landscape. They knew when birds returned. They remembered where nests could be found. Knowledge became nourishment. Eggs also offered something many prehistoric foods could not: efficiency. A single successful hunt might require hours or even days of tracking dangerous animals. Collecting eggs demanded patience and courage, especially from nests perched on cliffs or hidden in marshes. But the reward often came with far less risk than facing a charging wild boar or an injured deer. For growing children, pregnant women, and older members of the group, eggs provided concentrated nutrition in a form that was easy to cook and easy to share. They were one of nature's most reliable gifts. Yet wild eggs came with one serious limitation. Nature decided when they were available. When nesting season ended, so did the supply. Humanity had learned where to find eggs, but people still couldn't depend on them year-round. That problem remained unsolved for thousands of years. Then, sometime in the forests of Southeast Asia, humans made a discovery so ordinary that no one could have imagined its consequences. Instead of searching endlessly for wild nests, what if the birds came to us? That simple idea would change breakfast forever. More importantly, it would help lay the foundation for civilization itself. For tens of thousands of years, eggs were a gift of chance. Some seasons brought abundance, others brought nothing at all. Humanity had learned where birds nested, but people still lived by nature's schedule. Then, sometime around 8,000 years ago, something remarkable began to happen in the forests of Southeast Asia. Not with eggs, with birds. Hidden among the dense bamboo and tropical trees lived a cautious, brightly feathered animal known today as the red jungle fowl. Small, fast, always alert. It looked nothing like the plump chickens wandering through modern backyards. At first, humans probably had little interest in keeping these birds. Wild jungle fowl were difficult to catch, quick to escape, and produced relatively few eggs compared with modern breeds. Early evidence suggests they were valued for many reasons beyond food. Their colorful feathers were admired. Their calls marked the beginning of the day. In some communities, they were even associated with rituals, prestige, and eventually, cockfighting. No one could have predicted what would happen next. As people settled into permanent villages, a strange relationship slowly developed. The birds discovered something. Where humans lived, food was easier to find. Grain spilled onto the ground. Kitchen scraps accumulated outside homes. Predators were less common. Instead of humans chasing birds, the birds began following humans. It was less a moment of domestication than a partnership that formed over generations. People tolerated the birds because they cleaned up insects and leftover grain. The birds stayed because survival had become easier. Then came the unexpected reward. Every morning, there were eggs. Not hidden high on cliffs, not buried deep in marshes, not guarded in distant forests, just a short walk from home. It changed everything. For the first time in human history, families no longer had to wait for nesting season or risk dangerous climbs to gather one of nature's most complete foods. Food had become predictable, and predictability is one of the foundations of civilization. As chickens spread across Asia through trade and migration, they carried far more than feathers. They carried reliability. Villages that once depended entirely on seasonal hunting now had a steady source of fresh protein living just outside their doors. Children could help care for the birds. Older adults could collect eggs without joining dangerous hunts. Even a small flock could provide food week after week without being slaughtered. That was the true revolution. A chicken could feed a family without dying. Unlike cattle or pigs, which often represented a single large meal, hens produced again and again. One bird, hundreds of eggs over its lifetime. An investment that kept paying back. As agriculture expanded, chickens traveled with people into India, China, the Middle East, and eventually Europe and Africa. Each culture adapted them differently, but nearly all discovered the same advantage. Meat required sacrifice. Eggs required patience. The distinction transformed the economics of food. A household did not need vast fields or large herds to improve its diet. A few healthy hens were enough. Historians often credit wheat, rice, and barley with making cities possible. They were certainly essential, but grains alone could not provide everything growing populations needed. Eggs filled an important gap. They supplied concentrated nutrition, reproduced themselves, and required relatively little space or investment. Civilization was not built by a single invention. It was built by countless small improvements that made everyday life more secure. The domestication of the chicken was one of those quiet revolutions. It did not create kings, it did not build monuments, it simply made tomorrow's breakfast more likely than yesterday's. And once that happened, the egg stopped being a prize found in the wild. It became something even more powerful. A food that could nourish entire civilizations, one morning at a time. History remembers the people who wore crowns. It remembers the generals who won battles, the architects who built temples, the rulers who founded empires. But history rarely asks a simpler question. What did those people eat before they changed the world? More often than not, the answer included eggs. By the time the first great civilizations emerged, eggs had become far more than a convenient meal. They were no longer gathered only from wild nests. Chickens, ducks, and geese were now living alongside people, producing a dependable source of food that could be collected almost every day. It was one of humanity's quietest revolutions, and one of its most important. In ancient Egypt, where enormous workforces built temples, canals, and monuments, Poultry became increasingly common over the centuries. Wall paintings and archaeological discoveries showed ducks, geese, and later chickens being raised and traded. Eggs found their way into kitchens, bakeries, and households, providing valuable nutrition for both wealthy families and ordinary workers. They rarely appeared in grand inscriptions, yet they helped sustain the people who carved them. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks admired eggs not only as food, but also as symbols of life and renewal. Philosophers debated the mysteries of creation, while physicians such as Hippocrates recognized eggs as nourishing, easily digestible food for the sick and recovering. To them, an egg represented something remarkable: life enclosed within a fragile shell. The Romans took practicality even further. Their expanding empire depended on feeding soldiers, travelers, laborers, and growing cities. Eggs became a familiar part of Roman cooking, often served at the beginning of banquets and used in sauces, breads, and pastries. Wealthy Romans enjoyed elaborate dishes featuring eggs, while ordinary citizens valued them because they were affordable and nutritious. The Romans even had a saying, ab ovo usque ad mala, from the egg to the apples. It described a complete meal, from the eggs served at the beginning to the fruit offered at the end. The phrase survived long after the empire itself disappeared. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the east, another innovation was quietly changing history. In China, people discovered that eggs could last far longer than anyone thought possible. Instead of eating every fresh egg immediately, they developed preservation techniques using salt, clay, ash, and alkaline mixtures. Over time, these methods produced foods we now know as salted duck eggs and century eggs, remarkable examples of culinary ingenuity that allowed valuable nutrition to be stored for weeks or even months. It solved one of humanity's oldest problems. How do you keep food when nature stops providing it? The answer wasn't always another harvest. Sometimes it was preserving an egg. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, eggs became woven into the rhythms of everyday life in an entirely different way. The Christian calendar included long fasting periods, particularly during Lent, when many believers avoided meat and, in many places and periods, also refrained from eating eggs and dairy products. Hens, however, did not stop laying. Families carefully stored the surplus, preserving some in lime water or other traditional methods to extend their freshness. Then Easter arrived. After weeks of fasting, eggs returned to the table in celebration. They were boiled, decorated, shared with neighbors, given as gifts to children. What began as practical food slowly became one of the world's most enduring cultural traditions. Yet perhaps the greatest impact of eggs never came from palaces or churches. It came from ordinary homes. Across villages throughout Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, families carried baskets of eggs to local markets each morning. A few dozen eggs could be exchanged for flour, cloth, cooking oil, tools, or other necessities. For countless households, hens became more than livestock. They became a small but dependable source of income. Gold financed kingdoms. Silver funded wars. But eggs helped feed families, supported local markets, and nourished the workers who built civilizations day after day. That may explain why, unlike so many ancient foods that disappeared with the cultures that created them, eggs never went away. In fact, they were about to become more important than ever before. History is filled with foods that were once essential, ancient grains that no one grows anymore, forgotten fruits that disappeared with lost civilizations, recipes that vanished when kingdoms fell, entire cuisines erased by war, migration, or changing climates. Eggs survived them all. Why? The answer isn't tradition, it's practicality. Again and again, whenever humanity faced a new challenge, Eggs already had the solution. Need a food that is easy to carry? An egg comes in its own protective package. Need something nutritious? Few natural foods contain so much protein, healthy fat, vitamins, and minerals in such a compact form. Need food that can be produced almost anywhere? A handful of chickens can thrive in a village, on a farm, or even in a small backyard. Unlike cattle, they require little space. Unlike sheep, they need no vast pastures. Unlike crops, they do not depend on a single harvest. They simply keep laying. That quiet reliability became even more important as cities grew larger. By the 18th and 19th centuries, millions of people were leaving the countryside for rapidly expanding industrial cities. Families no longer raised all of their own food. Instead, they depended on markets supplied by increasingly complex transportation networks. Eggs adapted once again. Railroads carried them across entire countries. Steamships connected producers with distant cities. Improved packaging reduced breakage during long journeys. For the first time, fresh eggs could reach people who had never seen the farms where they were produced. Then came another revolution: machines. In the late 19th century, artificial incubators became increasingly reliable, allowing farmers to hatch far more chicks than nature alone could provide. Larger flocks meant more laying hens. Better breeding gradually produced chickens capable of laying far more eggs than their wild ancestors ever could. The numbers were astonishing. A wild jungle fowl might lay only a small clutch of eggs each year. A modern laying hen can produce well over 250 eggs annually, with some breeds laying more than 300 under carefully managed conditions. Thousands of years of selective breeding had transformed one of nature's modest birds into one of humanity's most productive food sources. Refrigeration completed the transformation. Homes, grocery stores, and refrigerated transport made it possible to keep eggs fresh for far longer than previous generations could have imagined. What had once been a seasonal food became available almost every day of the year. And that may be the greatest irony of all. The more successful eggs became, the less remarkable they seemed. Today, we open the refrigerator and expect them to be there. No dangerous climb, no careful search through marshes, no waiting for spring. Just another carton on the shelf. Perhaps that is the fate of history's greatest everyday inventions. When they solve a problem completely, we stop noticing the miracle. And yet, every breakfast quietly reminds us of a partnership that has lasted for thousands of years. A partnership that began long before the first cities and shows no sign of ending anytime soon. Empires have disappeared, trade routes have shifted, entire civilizations have risen, flourished, and faded into history. Yet one food has remained on our tables through every chapter of the human story: the egg. Not because it was fashionable, not because it was expensive, but because it never stopped being useful. Today, nearly every culture has found its own way to celebrate the egg. In Japan, it crowns bowls of steaming rice and ramen. Across Mexico, it becomes huevos rancheros, a breakfast that has started mornings for generations. In France, chefs transform it into delicate omelets. In China, eggs appear in everything from tomato stir-fries to preserved delicacies that have been perfected over centuries. In the United States, they are fried, scrambled, poached, boiled, baked, and folded into countless recipes that people rarely think twice about. Few ingredients are as universal. Even fewer are as adaptable. An egg can be breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert. It can stand alone or quietly hold an entire recipe together, giving structure to bread, cakes, pasta, sauces, and pastries. Modern nutrition has only reinforced what our ancestors discovered through experience thousands of years ago. Eggs provide high-quality protein along with essential vitamins and minerals, making them one of the most nutrient-dense foods available. While dietary advice has evolved over the years, Eggs continue to be recognized as an important part of a balanced diet for millions of people around the world. That is why eggs never became a relic of history. They evolved with us. As our civilizations changed, so did the ways we cooked them. As our technology improved, they became even more accessible. Some foods survive because they become symbols of a culture. Eggs survived because they became part of every culture. They are no longer a luxury. They are no longer a seasonal discovery hidden inside a wild bird's nest. They are something far more remarkable. A food that has quietly nourished humanity from the edge of the Stone Age to the modern breakfast table. Imagine that woman on the cliff one last time. The wind still whips across the rocks. The basket is still in her hands. She has no idea that thousands of generations later, people on the other side of the world will begin their mornings with the very same food she risked her life to collect. Her world is gone. The forests have changed. The birds have changed. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Yet the egg remains. Today, you open your refrigerator. A carton sits quietly on the shelf. You lift the lid, choose an egg, crack it into a pan. It takes only seconds. The shell breaks, breakfast begins. It feels so ordinary that it's easy to forget just how extraordinary that moment really is. Inside that simple shell is a story older than farming, older than writing, older than cities. It is the story of hunter-gatherers searching cliffs for wild nests, of the first villagers who welcomed chickens into their homes, of farmers collecting eggs at sunrise, of merchants carrying baskets to crowded marketplaces, of parents preparing meals that nourished countless generations before us. History remembers pyramids, it remembers emperors, it remembers great battles and magnificent monuments. But none of those achievements would have been possible without the ordinary meals that sustained ordinary people every single day. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the egg. Not that it changed history in a single dramatic moment, but that it quietly supported every chapter of the human story. The next time you crack an egg into a pan, remember this. You are holding one of humanity's oldest companions, a food that survived the Stone Age, witnessed the birth of civilization, outlived every empire, and continues to nourish billions of people today. Sometimes the greatest stories in history aren't carved into stone. Sometimes they arrive in the palm of your hand, protected by a fragile shell.